So let's make this logout button here work. For this, of course, we can give it the onClick prop and then trigger some function. A function which I'll add here, and a function which I'll name logout handler. So let's now bind that function to this button now by pointing at it, logout handler. And now to log out, we can again use another function provided by Next.js client. And that is the sign out function with a capital O. We had sign in for logging in. We have sign out for, well, signing out. So here we can call sign out like this. And that now also returns a promise, which tells us when it's done. But here I don't even care about that, because since I'm using use session, this component will be updated automatically anyways as soon as the active session changes. And it will change when we sign out. Next.js will then clear that cookie and clear that information that the active user is logged in. Hence, if I now save here, if I reload, I'm still logged in. I can still see the profile point here. But if I click log out, that changes. Now, if we go to application in the DevTools again, and we inspect our cookies, we also see that one very important cookie is missing. And that's this session token cookie. That's missing now because Next.js cleared that when we sent this sign out request. Now, of course, we can still sign in again, though, if we enter valid credentials. And then our UI updates appropriately. So that is how this works. That's how we can log out and update the UI. Now, of course, it would be nice that if we are logged in, we can't even visit this login page here. And on the other hand, if we are on profile and I log out, I don't want to be able to stay on that logout page. And that's also something which we can implement with Next.js. So, of course, if we are not logged in, we shouldn't be able to visit this profile page. And if we were on that page and we click log out, we should be redirected. And implementing that is rather straightforward with Next.js. All we have to do in the end is go to the pages which we want to protect or restrict in some way, like the profile page here, and then also use some Next.js functionality there, either directly on that page or in a component of that page, like here the user profile component. Here I want to redirect away if we're not authenticated. And to implement this, I will again import use session from next-auth/client, and then again get access to my session data here. So here I'll then check session and maybe also loading, extract these two pieces, which we get when we call use session. And now in the end, I want to do a couple of things. First of all, I want to check if we're loading. If we're loading, then I want to return a different content and show loading as a text. By doing that, if we save this, I don't see all that content immediately if I shouldn't see it. Now the styling is a bit off. To fix that, I'll give that a class name of classes profile like this, and now at least it's centered. But at the moment, I only see loading then. It never changes. And indeed, that is how use session behaves, at least at the moment. Use session returns the session and loading, but there is this scenario that if you load a page, loading stays true and it doesn't really update. I'm not sure if it's a bug or a feature, but it is what it is. Thankfully, there is a way around that though. Besides use session, there also is get session. And the difference is that with use session, we immediately get this session and loading thing here. And then both session and loading could change if session data was fetched. If we have no session because we're logged out, session will never change though. And as we see, loading unfortunately also doesn't change. It stays true. Get session works differently. getSession sends a new request and gets the latest session data, and we can then react to the answer, to the response for that request. And that allows us to manage our own loading state whilst we're getting the session and act accordingly. It's a bit more cumbersome, requires more work from our side, but it is the way around this issue which we have here. And it's not too difficult to implement in the end. We just need to manage our own state with useState. So we should import useState from React. And that will be our own loading state. So here I can manage isLoading and setIsLoading. And actually we can set this to true initially to, start in that loading state. Then we can manage another piece of data, and that would be our session, which initially is undefined. So here we have the loaded session and set loaded session. And now we can use useEffect, this useEffect hook, which we also have to import from React, to get the session when this component is rendered. So here in this effect function, I will call getSession. So what I'm importing here from Next.auth client, I'll execute this. And this will then return a promise. So here we can use then or use async await. For that, we would wrap it into an extra function though, since we shouldn't make that effect function async. Hence here, I'll just work with then, and I will get my session here eventually as an argument. And now here, session may be null if we don't have a session. So if Next.auth determines that this user is not logged in, or it will be an object with the session data if the opposite is the case. And since here we only care about whether we have a session or not, the only thing we need to do here is call setLoadedSession and set this to the session once we're done, and setIsLoading to false here eventually. Like this. Now we don't use useSession anymore here because it didn't work as it should here. And therefore now we have this approach instead. Now what's the benefit of this approach? Well, now we can use our own isLoading state here to show this loading message. And we can now react to isLoading being false, so the loading being done, and us not having a session. We can redirect away then. And actually, if that's our goal, instead of managing that extra session state, if we don't need the session for anything else than navigating away, then the only thing we have to do here is check inside of this then block if session is not truthy, so if we don't have a session, and in that case we navigate away. So I'll set isLoading, but if we don't have a session, I will actually navigate away by using window location ref, which changes the URL in the browser, and changing this to off, for example. So now if we don't find a session, we navigate away with this code. Otherwise, eventually, loading will be false and we do have a session, then we render this content. With that workaround implemented, if we now go back and I reload, you see this page loads. If I log out, on the other hand, I'm redirected. And if I now manually visit profile, I also am redirected eventually. Now we do see the other page content flash here for a brief moment. And the reason for that is me setting setIsLoading to false here, no matter what. Actually, I want to do this in the else case here. If we do have a session, we stay on this page, and only then I want to set isLoading to false. If I do that and go to /profile, we only see loading briefly. And we see loading briefly because we do have that brief moment where we don't know yet whether we are authenticated or not. But with that, we implemented the desired behavior here. And we need this workaround because of how useSession works. It fulfills its purpose in the header, and it updates the UI correctly there. But if we rely on the differences between being in a loading state and not having a session, or not having a session because we're not authenticated, directly after loading a page, In that case, use session didn't help us, and this workaround does. It's not the only way of solving this problem, though. So we are now protecting that profile page, and we redirect away if we're not authenticated. If I do log in, on the other hand, if I use valid credentials, I can go to profile and I see that page. And I can also directly enter profile and I see that page. But that brief moment of loading, which flashes on the screen when we enter profile when not authenticated, that is maybe something we want to get rid of. Now, we can't really get rid of it with just client-side code. Because if we visit this page and we then use client-side JavaScript code to determine whether we are authenticated or not, then we'll always need to wait that fraction of a second to find out if we are. But we must not forget that Next.js blends server-side and client-side code. So we can use server-side code to determine whether the user who sent the request is authenticated or not, and return different page content and possibly a redirect if the user is not authenticated. For this, we need to go to the profile page and then add an extra function. The question now just is which function. We could, of course, add the getStaticProps function here. This would allow us to fetch data for this page in advance. But that's the wrong function. Why? Because you must not forget that getStaticProps runs during build time. Yes, it can also run thereafter with revalidate set to a certain duration, but it mainly runs during build time. It does absolutely not run for every incoming request. Now here in this case, every incoming request matters though, because we need to find out if that user is logged in or not. And that's why instead we should use get server-side props. That will then get a context object where we get access to the incoming request. And the good thing about get session, which I'm using in the profile, the user profile component here, get session, the good thing about this function is that you're not limited to using it on client-side code only. You can, as you see, it works in a component, but you can also use getSession on the server side, even though it's imported from Next.auth client. So we can copy that import and bring that over to profile.js here and import that on this page, in this page file. And then here in get server-side props, we can also call get session and actually pass in an object where we set a request key, a rec key, to the incoming request, which we get out of the context we're receiving here, context.rec. Don't forget that you have access to the request object through that context when using get server-side props. And we pass this request, which we get here, into this get session function through that rec key in that configuration object. And then get session will automatically look into that request and extract the data it needs, the session token cookie to be precise, and see if that's valid and if the user is authenticated and if that cookie even exists to begin with. So that will all happen behind the scenes. We just need to call get session here. And we can convert this into an async function and await this, since this will return a promise. And as a result, we'll get our session. And this will be null if the user is not authenticated, and it will be a valid session object if the user is authenticated. So now with that in place, we can act accordingly. We can check if not session, so if it's null, if we don't have a session, if the visiting user is not authenticated, and in that case, we return an object here inside of get server-side props, where we maybe set redirect to an object to redirect the user. That is something you learned about in an earlier course section. This object, which you return in get server-side props and in get static props, typically is an object where you set props for the component. But as you learned, you're not limited to that. You can also set the not found key to true to show the 404 page, or you set the redirect to an object where you describe the redirect you want to issue. And that will then redirect the user to a different page without even flashing that user profile page. This redirect object then wants a destination key where you specify the path you want to redirect to, for example, to the auth page. And you can add permanent to indicate if that's a permanent redirect, which will always apply, or only a temporary one. And here we definitely want to set permanent to false to make it clear that it's only this time that we redirect, because the user is not logged in. Now, if we don't make it into this if block, we know that there is a session, the user is logged in, and hence we want to return an object where we don't set not found to anything and where we don't redirect, but where we instead just set our props. And if we want, we can then pass the session as a prop to the page, like this. So now we use get server-side props for that. And that means that in the user profile component, we can now get rid of our client-side code. We can comment this out or delete this, because this component, this user profile component here, let me remove the imports, this component, which is used by the profile page, will only be rendered if that page renders. And that page will only render if we are authenticated because of our get server-side props logic. And that might be the more elegant way of handling this, because with this, if we save that, if I'm not logged in and I then visit /profile, I don't even see the profile page flashing. Instead, I'm instantly redirected. Now, if I do log in though, if I do enter valid credentials, then I can go to the profile page and I can also enter it like this and it loads. And that is maybe the more elegant way of handling this, which is why I also wanted to show it to you. Now, with that, however, let's make sure that we also implement something similar for the auth page. Here, after logging in successfully, I also want to redirect away to the profile page, let's say, and I want to make sure that we can't load the auth page if I am logged in already. So let's see if we can find a solution for this as well. Just a side note, because I see it, this warning which is showing up here, we can ignore it for now. We will set this environment variable later. So let's now work on that auth page and make sure that when we log in, so here in the auth form component, that if we called sign in and we did sign in successfully, that we then redirect, and that if we load this page, even though we are logged in already, we also maybe navigate away. Now let's start with redirecting after logging in successfully. We can simply do this here in this if check. Here we check if we don't have an error, so if signing in succeeded, and that is when we want to redirect. Now we could again redirect with window location ref, but that basically resets the entire application. That is fine for an initial page load, but if we already worked in this application and we have this single page application already going on, then we probably don't want to reset the entire application and lose all our state. Even though in this app we wouldn't lose much, but of course that's not necessarily the case for every app. So therefore, instead here for redirecting, the better way of doing that is by using the Next router. So we can import from Next/router, and from there we can import the use router hook. And then in our component function, we simply call use router here to get access to that router. We already worked with the router earlier in the course already. Now we work with it again. And once we got access to it, here we can simply call replace. And replace will basically redirect us. It will replace the current URL with a different one. And we can, for example, go to /profile here. And if we do that, if we implement this, now if I go back and I do log in with valid credentials here, after logging in, I'm redirected to that profile page. Of course, on the login page, we could show some loading state whilst this login request is on its way, but that is some UI feedback which you of course can add. The core functionality works. Now I just want to make sure that I can't visit this auth page if I am logged in already. And we could again implement this with get server-side props to check the authentication status when a request reaches that route. Alternatively, we implement our client-side workaround. And I'll do that here just to practice this again. For this on the auth page or in the auth form, doesn't really matter. Let's maybe do it here in the auth page. For this here, I want to use useEffect, so import that from React so that we can call getSession in there. And for that, we need to import getSession from Next.js/auth/client. And then here in useEffect, we have this effect function and our dependency array without any dependencies here, since we have no special dependencies. And we call getSession. And then here we find out whether we have a session or not. And then here I want to check if we do have a session, because here the problem is if we are authenticated already. And if we do have a session, then I want to redirect away. For this here, we can either redirect with window location ref or with the router. So we can import use router from next router like this, get access to the router, use router like that. And then in here, simply call router replace and go to the starting page, for example. And now add router as a dependency since it technically is one, though it of course shouldn't change. So now we redirect if we are authenticated. Of course, I don't want to show the auth form whilst I'm still figuring out whether we are authenticated or not. And therefore, again, we can use state here, importing it from React, to have our isLoading state whilst we are figuring out whether we have a session or not. And this starts with a value of true. But here, if we don't have a session, and therefore we need to log in, and therefore we want to show the auth form, if that's the case, I'll set isLoading to false here. And then again, we can show some fallback whilst we are loading, and return a paragraph where we say loading like this. This will not be styled in any way. You could, of course, add some styling. With that, if I enter /auth here in the URL, we see loading briefly and then I'm redirected. So that works. And with that, we now also protect our auth page and the profile page. And we make sure that depending on our authentication status, we can only reach and use different kinds of pages, and we can't visit all the pages all the time. And that, of course, is an important part of authentication. Now, we made good progress. Before we explore this change password feature and all of that, there is a little optimization which you could consider implementing, especially if you had a bigger application. At the moment, we're using this session functionality in a couple of different components. To be precise, we use session in the main navigation component. Now, one problem we have with that is that if we are authenticated and I reload whilst on this profile page, then we figure out whether the user is authenticated or not in that get server-side props function of that page. Here, this function runs. And then after the page was loaded, this use session hook, which we use in main navigation, will technically also again run some logic to find out whether we have a session or not. And we see this here in the network tab. If I reload, you see there is a request being sent to /API/auth/session. That request is actually sent by that use session hook. And it's sent to check whether that session cookie which it found is valid, because we can't validate that with client-side JavaScript for security reasons. Hence, that cookie needs to be sent to an endpoint, which then determines whether it is valid or not. So that's why this request is being sent. There is nothing wrong with this request, but since we already checked our session here in get server-side props when we loaded /profile, we already know that we are authenticated. So this is actually a redundant request which is being sent here. And we can avoid it by using an extra component offered by Next.auth. In our _app.js file, so in this file which wraps all our page components which are being rendered, we can import the special provider component from Next.auth/client. This is a wrapper which we can wrap around all our other components, so around the layout and the nested component. And then provider wants a session prop. And here we simply set any session data which we might already have. Now the interesting thing is that here in this root app component, we don't just get the page component that should be loaded, but also the props for that page. So the props determined by get static props or get server-side props. And at least for our profile page, these props will contain a session key with the session we validated inside of get server-side props. So we are setting this session prop on this profile page, and we are setting it to this session which we already loaded and validated with that server-side code. That means that not all our pages, but some pages, in this case the profile page, will have a session prop with session data. So we can set the session for this provider component equal to pageprops.session. In most cases, this will be undefined, because most pages don't have this prop. But our profile page, for example, does have it. And then the session is already set to this already loaded session. And that then allows Next.auth to skip the extra session check performed by useSession if we already have the session from our get server-side props function. Now, if we loaded another component, where this is not set, session is undefined, and useSession will still do its thing and check it manually. But in cases where we already know that there is a session, we can save some performance and avoid some redundant HTTP requests. And that's never a bad thing, simply by wrapping our application with this extra provider component and utilizing the information which we already have. Now here in my case, I actually still see this extra session request being made here thereafter. Next.auth will have its reasons. Nonetheless, using this provider wrapper is a recommended pattern because it theoretically or practically allows Next.auth to optimize itself internally and skip certain checks and possibly HTTP requests. Even though we unfortunately don't see that here, nonetheless, adding this extra wrapper is a recommended optimization, which I therefore, of course, also wanted to show to you. Over the last lectures, we ensured that we can log in and log out and create users, and that we protect certain pages, and that we control which page can be visited if we're logged in or logged out, that certain pages like the profile page can't be visited, that we're redirected automatically, and all of that works now. All of that works with help of the Next.auth package and the session which it checks for us. And just to make this really clear, when I say session here, I am talking about this JSON web token, which is managed automatically by Next.auth, which is stored by Next.auth in our browser. This cookie, which holds this token, is created there. And Next.auth determines whether we have an active session, so if this user is logged in, by checking that cookie and that token that's stored in that cookie. That is what happens when we call get session here, or in our main navigation component when we use the use session hook. And that's what we did up to this point. Now, one crucial feature is missing, one of the main reasons for adding authentication. Because having this client-side protection here is nice, protecting certain pages and making sure we can't reach certain pages is all nice and good. But what really matters is what we as a user can do, which API routes we can hit. Here we got this change password example. But of course, for example, if you're building an online shop, you might only want to allow logged in users to create and delete and manage products. And in the interface, which your website has for managing those products, you would be sending requests behind the scenes to certain API endpoints, certain API routes, where those requests then trigger certain operations, like the creation of a product or the deletion of a product. And of course, you want to make sure that those requests only trigger those operations if they come from authenticated users. So that if you have API routes in your project, API routes that do certain operations that are only allowed for authenticated users, that in those API routes, you also verify whether that request is coming from an authenticated user or not. Because even if you have full control over this user interface, requests to APIs can also be sent with other tools. From the command line, with tools like Postman, which allows you to create HTTP requests. So there are ways of sending requests to APIs that don't require your website. And therefore, protecting the pages on those websites is one thing, but we also need protection in those API routes where we validate incoming requests and double check that this request is coming from an authenticated source. And I'm emphasizing this here because this is another key part of authentication. It's not just about the client side, it is also about the server side, about those API routes. And that's therefore what we're going to take a closer look at now. Now, to take a closer look at API routes and how we can protect those, I will take this change password example. This clearly is an operation that should be restricted. Not every user should be allowed to change a password. It only makes sense for authenticated users. And hence I will add a new API route, and we can add it in the API auth folder, but we could also add it somewhere else. And to show that it does not have to be in the auth folder, I will create another folder in the pages API folder, and that will be the user folder. But you could add it in auth as well. And in there, I'll add the change-password.js file because I want to create an API route which can be reached by sending a request to /API/user/change-password. That's reaching this file then. Now in this file, we're not going to use Next.auth, at least not as we did it in this square bracket Next.auth file. Instead, we're going to create our own API route just as we learned it in this course. So I'll create a handler function here, which gets a request and a response, and I'll then export this as a default here. And now in this handler function, we want to extract the old and new password, which the user entered here. We want to verify that the request is coming from an authenticated user and deny further action if it's not. We want to get the email address of that authenticated user then. And then we want to look into the database, see if we find that user there, see if the old password that was entered matches the current password in the database. And if that's the case, we want to replace that old password with a new password. So that's what we're now going to do over the next minutes. Now for that, in the handler function in the change-password.js file here, let's first of all check if the incoming request has the right method. And for changing the password, a post or a put or a patch request makes sense. These are the three kinds of requests that imply that resources on the server should be created or changed. And you can argue whether changing a password is creating a new resource, a new password, or changing an existing resource, an existing user. And I will go for the latter argument, and I want to say that I only want to continue here if the incoming request has a method of patch. So if it's not patch, then we will just return and not continue at all. We will only continue for patch requests, which of course means that in the front end, so in our client-side code, we'll have to make sure that we do send a patch request to this API route later. So that's check number one. Check number two is whether that request is coming from an authenticated user or not. And if it's not, we also want to return with an error. And for this, we can again use this getSession function here, which we already used on the profile page. There we are already using it in server-side code instead of get server-side props. So we already see that it runs on the server as well as on the client, and that of course means that we can again use it in our API route, which also is server-side code. So therefore, in the change_password.js file, I will again import getSession from next.auth/client. The /client can be confusing, but this does work on the server as well, as we saw. And then we want to check if we do get a session. For this, we can store a session in a constant, and we get it by calling getSession. And then, as you learned on the server side, we can pass in an object where we set the rec key to the request we're getting here. GetSession needs that incoming request because it will then look into that request, see if a session token cookie is part of the request. If it is, it will validate and extract that data from that cookie. And if that all then makes sense, it will give us this session object. Now getSession actually returns a promise, and to use async await, I'll turn this into an async function and await here. So now we get our session, or we don't get one if the user is not authenticated, and therefore we can check if not session, if that's undefined, which means the request is not authenticated. And in that case, we also want to return, and here we maybe also want to send back a response. We could send one back in this first if check as well, a special response, but I don't care about that here. But here I actually do want to send back a response with a status code of 401, which basically is the standard status code for saying that authentication is missing. And then possibly some extra data attached, like a message of not authenticated. But of course, it's up to you which kind of data, if any, you want to send back. So that's now another important check. And that is the key check of this module, of this course module. Because this line here, or this block of code, that's the code where we validate whether a request is authenticated or not. This is the code with which we protect our API route against unauthenticated access. And every API route that does something that should only be allowed to authenticated users needs code like this. Everything else we're going to write in this API route is not directly related to authentication. Yes, we're going to change the password of a user, and that of course has something to do with authentication. But on the other hand, changing a password is really not that different from creating a product. We're just changing some data in the database in the end. Okay, so now that we got this protection code here in place, in the next step we know that this request is coming from an authenticated user, and we know that it's a request with the right method. So now we need to extract data from the incoming request, the old and the new password, and we will also need the email address of that user. Because of course in the database we store users with emails and passwords, and if we want to change the password of a user, we need that email address of the user as well to identify that user. Thankfully, getting that email address is not too difficult, even though it's not part of this form here, because we do encode the email address in our token. We return that object here in our Next.js file, and that data ends up in the token, and therefore it's part of that session which we get here. So we can get the user email by accessing session.user.email here. And we can then also get the other data, like the old password, by reaching out to the request and there the body field as we learned it. So that's what we also do in the signup.js file when we create a user. There we also get the email and password by diving into the request body in the end. And here in change password, we could, for example, expect that on the body we got a old password field, and then we got the new password, which we get from request body.new password. Of course, we'll have to make sure that when we send a request from the client to the server later, that we have old and new password, that we have these two fields in the request data, which we attach to the outgoing request. And with that, we got all the data we need. Now we want to connect to the database and find a user by that email. And then once we got that user, we want to check if the old password is correct. So if it matches the password currently stored in the database. And if that's then the case, we want to hash the new password and replace the old password with the new one. And for this, of course, we can call connect to database again and import that from our libdb file like this. And then here call connect to database and await this, of course. And here we then get the client. And then once we got the client, we can reach out to the database and then there to the collection that stores our users, which is the users collection here. So here we then reach out to the users collection. Users collection, I can store access to that collection in a separate constant. And then we can use that users collection to find one user by email, as we did it before as well in the authentication code. There we also find a user by email. And now we're going to do the same thing here. We look for the email field in our documents and check if we find one document where the email address stored in the document is equal to the user email we get from the session. Now this will return a promise, so we await that, and then we'll get a user document, or not. But if we somehow don't find a user, something is wrong anyways, because that user email is coming from the session. So it would be strange if we have a logged in user and yet he or she is missing from the database. But still, we can also handle that case, close our connection here, and then possibly also return some error. This could be a 404 error where we say user not found or something like this. Now, if we make it past this check, which we typically should, we can now verify the password. So we get the current password by accessing user.password. So this user document, which we get from the database, and there the password field, which is this hashed password. That's the current password now. And now we want to verify this. And for that, in the lib folder, we have this auth.js file with the verify password function. And I want to call this function now. And hence we need to import verify password from libauth. We need to add this import. And with it imported, we can call verify password and pass in the incoming password, so the old password in our case, as a first argument. And then the stored hashed password to which we want to compare it, so this current password here, as a second argument. And we then await this because that returns a promise. And we get back the answer to the question whether the passwords are equal or not. And if they are not equal, if not passwords are equal, if that is false, then we know that the old password entered here simply does not match the user's password. And in this case, we don't want to allow the user to change the password, of course. So here we want to return. We want to also close our client connection. And we want to send back a response where the status code could be 403, not 401 as it was before, but 403, where we say you are authenticated. That's why it's not 401, but you're not authorized for this operation. You simply do not have the permissions to perform this operation, even though you're authenticated. And in this case, the user doesn't have the permissions for this specific operation because the passwords are not equal. Of course, alternatively, we could also use 422, which kind of indicates that the user input is incorrect. And that would be a fair assumption here as well, that the user simply mistyped the old password. Ultimately, it's up to you which status code you want to use, because after all, it will also be you who has to handle these status codes in the front-end code when it comes to showing an error message to the users. So here I'll go for 403 and then also attach some data with a message key where I say invalid password or something like this. Now, if we do make it past this if check though, then we know that the passwords are equal, and then we can replace the old password in the database with the new one. Now, for this, we can use our users collection again and call update1 to update1 document. And for that, we now need to pass in a first argument where we identify the document that should be updated. And in this case, that's the document where the email matches the user email. So the same filter as we set it up here for finding a user. But then here we also need to pass in a second argument where we describe the update. Now for describing the update, we also pass in a JavaScript object as a second argument. And in there we add the special $set key. This is a special key which will be identified and understood by MongoDB. And $set then wants a nested object as a value where we just set the properties of the document that should change. So in this case, for example, I don't want to change the email, I don't want to change the ID, I want to change the password. So as a value for $set, I have an object where I set password. And now this key here has to match one of the keys of your document, or it's added as a new key if it doesn't, which I don't want here. So here I'll set password to the new password. But of course, as you learned, not like this. Instead, we want to hash that new password first, because if the password is changed, we of course still don't want to store plain text passwords in the database. And therefore here, I'll now create my hashed password by calling hash password, which is a function we have to import from the libof file as well. And when we call hash password, we pass the new password, the plain text password, as an argument, and then await this operation since it returns a promise. And we then get this hashed password, and that's then the password we want to set for the update1 operation. And this will now update the user in the database. Now we can also await this operation, and we can get the result and do something with it if we want to. Here I don't actually need it, but still I'll get it. And we can also add error handling as we did it before in the course. But for the moment I'll ignore all of that. I'll then just close the client connection and then send back a response with a status code of 200 where we, for example, say password updated. Like this. And now with all that in place, with all that code added, we should have the code that does change the password of an authenticated user. And therefore, now with that all in place, we now need to go to the front end and work on the front end code to send a HTTP request to this newly added API route. So let's now connect the frontend to the backend by sending a request to this change password API route. For this, we got this user profile component and there the profile form component, which is responsible for rendering this form. And it's here where I now want to handle the form submission, extract the entered values, and then send a HTTP request or send that extracted data to the parent component, so to the user profile component, and then there send the HTTP request, depending on where we want to do that. So let's start with handling form submission and getting the entered data. For this, we can add a new function here in the profile form component, the submit handler, or however you want to call it. There we get the event object, and we can call event prevent default to prevent the browser default of sending a request automatically, which we don't want. We want to control that with JavaScript and send our own request. And then we can point at this submit handler on the onSubmit prop on the form. That is step number 1. Now for extracting the entered values, we could use state and listen to changes on these inputs with every keystroke with the onChange event. Or we use refs to extract the values right when we need them, and I'll do that latter approach. I'll use that latter approach. Hence, I'll call useRef here, and of course import useRef from React to set up a reference and create a old password ref here, and then duplicate this to also create a new password ref. And now we need to connect these refs to the inputs. So here with the ref prop, we connect the new password field to the new password ref and the old password field to the old password ref. And now we can use these refs in the submit handler to get the entered values. So the entered old password can be extracted by using the old password ref, then .current, as we always do on refs, .value, and the same for the entered new password. Here we use the new password ref and get the value. Now we could add validation here, so we could check if the values are valid. So that is something we can do here. But just as before, I'll not do it here because we, in the end, don't proceed on the server side anyways if the input is wrong, and I want to focus on that authentication and server-side part here. So I will just assume that the entered inputs are correct, and with that assumption, we now can send the HTTP request or pass that data to a parent component, which then sends the HTTP request. It's up to you what you want to do. I will go for the parent component here, and therefore in the profile form component function, I'll accept this props argument, and then here call, let's say, a function which we get on the onChange password prop. The prop name is of course up to you since it's your component. And as a argument to this function, which I expect to get on this prop, I pass an object with the old password, which is set equal to the entered old password, and the new password, which I'll set equal to the entered new password. Now we just need to make sure that we set such a onChange password prop on the profile form component when we use it, and that is something we do in the user profile component. Here we use the profile form component, here we add the onChange password prop, and then point at a function which will be passed into the profile form through that prop. So here we can add the, let's say, change password handler function and pass this as a value into profile form. And here we get the password data. So this object with the old and new password, we get that here. And then in here, we can send this HTTP request. And we do this with the fetch function again. And the URL is /API/user to target this user folder in the API folder, /change-password to target this change password file. Now we need to configure this request with this second argument and, for example, change the request method. Here we expect to get a patch request, otherwise we don't continue. And hence, when we send this request, we need to set the method here to patch. Then we want to add a body, so data to that request in JSON format. And here I'll just forward my password data, which is this object with an old password and new password field. And you have to make sure that you have old password and new password written like this in this object, so that you use these property names, because it's old password and new password which I try to extract in my API route on that incoming body. So if you picked different names here in this object, which you create in the profile form component, then you need to extract these same names in the API route. Here I'm using equal names everywhere, and therefore this should work. Now last but not least, I'll add my headers here and set the content type to application JSON to make it clear that this request carries JSON data. Now that returns a promise, and to use async await, I'll turn this into an async function and await this and get my response here. And then here I will simply get my response data by awaiting response.json, and then I'll just log that data here. And of course, we typically want to give the user more feedback. Logging to the console is not something we want to do because the user won't see this, but this is only for us as a developer here to check whether it works. So now if we save all of that, this should work. And if we now go to this profile page and reload it, if I open the developer tools, we can test this now. For this, I'll enter a new password, and I'll start by entering an incorrect old password. If I now click on change password, I get a 403 error, which says invalid password, which makes sense because I entered an incorrect old password. Now I want to try the correct old password, but before I do that, let's go to MongoDB Atlas and find those documents here again to update this. And let's try to memorize this string. Of course, not the entire string, but we see that it starts with this strange part, has a dot, then lowercase ck, uppercase ap, ends with w8a. These are things we can memorize. And if everything works, now that I update the password with a correct old password, this string should change now because we override that existing password with a new hashed password. So if I now click change password with the correct old password, I get back password updated, which looks good. And if I now find documents again here, indeed, that is a new hashed password. And if I now log out here and I try to log in again with the old password, that should fail. And it looks like it does because I'm not redirected. If I would still be logging my data here, we should see that we have an error there, but I'm not logging it anymore. We're not handling this case that it fails. Hence, we get no feedback on the UI. But we clearly are not logged in because we're not redirected. But if I now try the correct new password and I click login, now I am redirected. So now logging in did work. And I can then navigate around as I did before, reload this page, and that all works. And that's now how we can also work with our protected API route, which also requires authentication, but which now checks authentication on the server side instead of on the client side or for the client side pages as we did it before. Now that is it for this module. You could enhance this application by handling errors and giving the user more feedback. But that would all be standard React. There's nothing authentication specific about that. It's just standard React as we used it over and over throughout this course. In this module, I wanted to focus on the authentication specific parts, how you can protect routes and pages, how you can create users, log users in, log users out, and check their authentication status. And that's what we did in this module. Now there's only one last thing left, one last to do, and that's this warning which we're getting here, that the next auth URL environment variable is not set. We can learn in the official Next auth docs that this is an environment variable which you should set when deploying for production. Now, I did show you how you can set environment variables for development and production in the deployment course section. And you can apply what you learned there to add an environment variable of that name and then set it to the domain under which you're going to host your application in production. And that's important. We're only talking about production here. For development, you don't need to do that. You can, of course, also inject that value for this environment variable through your hosting provider. For example, when using Versal, which we used in the deployment section, there you also had an environment variables part in your dashboard where you could set environment variables and their values. And there you could also set this environment variable to your actual domain, your actual URL that leads to your website. So that is something you want to add when deploying your application that uses authentication. But with that, we're done, and you now learned how authentication works with Next.js and how it helps you with authentication, and how you can manage users, creating users, logging users in, protecting pages and routes, changing the UI when users are logging in and logging out, and how you can also protect your API routes. Now, it is worth noting that there are more providers than the credentials provider we used. This is the provider where you manage your own users with email, password, or whatever your credentials are. You can also use a third-party provider like Apple or Amazon or GitHub or Facebook. All of that is possible as well. You can bring those providers as well. And if you want to add this kind of authentication to your application, simply check out the Next Auth docs for that provider you want to use, and you then learn how you can add that provider to your application. And providers in this Next Auth file, which you always need, providers is an array. So you can also add multiple providers to your application so that you can offer multiple login alternatives to your users. So Next Auth is very powerful and flexible, and in this module, you learned how you can use it.